Hello and welcome to episode 278 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, welcome back. How are we doing?
I'm good, Andy. It's been another good week at Money to the Masses. We've done a hell of a lot, some really good research stuff on 80/20 Investor, which I'm really pleased about. And actually that forms one of the pieces for this week's podcast. And I also, on a completely separate, unrelated point, I discovered where all the odd adult socks that you see laying in the street, where they came from. You know, you see them and you wander around wondering, how do people's adult odd socks appear in the street? And I finally seen one being released in the wild to now to be able to share with people how they get there. Just quickly before we carry on with the show, I took my daughter to preschool one morning and she always asked me to take her, and I drove her to the preschool. We jumped out of the car, we went to go into the school gate, and just as we were about to go in, another dad with his young daughter came towards us, and being polite, I let him go first. As he walked in to the school playground, I followed behind and I started to notice something black flapping out the back of his left trouser leg. And I wondered what that was. And I mean, he's wearing trousers and shoes. And I suddenly noticed it was a sock. But clearly what this guy had done is take off his trousers last night, as probably a lot of us men might do, and our socks in one go. And it was all just bundled together. And he'd obviously put them on in a rush in the morning, and one of them had been trapped inside the trouser leg. And as he walked across the playground, the sock was steadily freeing itself from his left trouser leg. And I was in this really awkward position where I wanted to save his embarrassment, but I also didn't really feel that I could have a conversation with somebody, say, sorry, you got a sock that's about to drop out your trouser leg. So I didn't say anything. And we stopped, just waiting outside for our children to be called into their classroom. And I just couldn't take my eyes off this sock that was steadily just escaping from his trouser leg. And then it finally did free itself, and he was completely unaware of all of this. And he said goodbye to his daughter. She was called in ahead of my daughter. And he turned around and walked out. And of course, he just left his dirty sock in the middle of the playground. And I almost stopped him and said, sorry, excuse me, you've forgotten your sock. But of course, can you imagine the conversation, how that would have gone if you'd said to a man who was fully dressed with his shoes and socks on, to say that a random sock in the playground was his sock? And I just thought, this is just getting worse. So I just didn't say anything. And so this sock was abandoned in the playground, and my daughter then wasn't even paying attention, then turned around and went to skip off. She's only 4, into the classroom, and she went, oh, look, there's a sock on the floor. And I said, oh, yeah, there is, isn't there? And just thinking, don't touch it. It's dirty. I've seen it. I know how it's got there. And then I walked off, and I don't know what happened to that sock. And that was it. So I finally have solved the riddle of where everybody's odd socks go, why you only have odd socks, and why you see them laying in the street. It's because people are wearing the same clothes the next day, putting them on, perhaps in the dark, I don't know. And then the socks are being freed across the UK. So there we go, Andy. That was one of those revelations in life that I just feel more complete for knowing that. But it did remind me of another story, which I'll go into another time. I'm always now become that guy who who says to people that they've got something in their teeth because of a situation like that actually unraveled to the point that it was just embarrassing for the other person. And I felt sorry for not rescuing them. I'll probably share it because it is money related. It came from when I worked in a bank, but something quite similar to that. But yeah, would you have said anything?
I think I would, because I was in that similar situation recently, not about the whole sock thing, which I think, by the way, is absolute genius. Not that you really discovered it, you kind of accidentally witnessed what happened, but genuinely, I think you've stumbled across something there which is truly brilliant. And I think this podcast could go viral as a result. So well done on that. But I was in a restaurant fairly recent, last Christmas. And there was a lady who rocked up to the bar looking fabulous in a brand new, I think they call it a romper suit, where it's like trousers and top all in one. Get me with up with the trends. And she had a massive price label hanging off the back of the top part of this thing, and it was so big, it was down beyond like the middle part of her back, and it was a Primark label, and it had like I can't remember the price. It was not expensive. It looked fantastic. Don't get me wrong. She looked great in it, but there was a massive price label hanging off the back of this thing.
She was planning on taking it back.
I don't know what it was, but she had her hair done. She looked great. She was with her family. And I had that awkward thing of like, do I tap her on the shoulder and let her know? Because everyone can see this. It was quite a busy pub. Everyone was eating and hanging around and having drinks. It was Christmas time. I thought, this poor girl, I'm going to have to let her know. And I did. I tapped her on the shoulder and I said, look, I'd probably want someone to tell me. So I'm just letting you know that the price is hanging off the back. And of course, the rest of her group absolutely ripped her, unnecessarily so. I have to say, we've all probably made that mistake. But I think she appreciated it.
Yeah. See, if the next meetup we have in the pub, when I have food in my teeth or anything like that, what I'm saying is I want people to tell me, because I'm one of those people that I'd rather know than not know and wander around. So although she got ridiculed by all her friends because of you, Andy, I probably think it was the right thing to do. Anyway.
Yeah, let's get moving then. So what have we got on the podcast this week?
The first piece is an investment piece that's based around perfect portfolios. Now, we touched upon one called the All-Weather Portfolio before by Ray Dalio, and these are portfolios that have been based upon books or research that are supposed to be portfolios that produce outperformance over the long term and outperform in all market conditions. So they're incredibly interesting, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to have a look at them. So what I did this week as part of 80/20 is I looked at these portfolios to see how they performed over the short term, particularly during the coronavirus period, the last sort of 5-10 years, and look at the learnings from them, because they've got different asset allocations. And as I'll come on to, there was a reason also why I wanted to look at this topic in relation to diversification. So it's an interesting piece that I think people can learn from in terms of building their own asset mix. The next piece I want to do is touch upon redundancy and redundancy rules and payments. So unfortunately, we're in a period where there'll be a lot of people out there who will be made redundant in the sort of coming weeks and months because of what's happened with the coronavirus and the economic contraction that we've experienced. So I wanted to look at that, just to do a piece that looks at some of the rules just to inform people if they find themselves in that situation, and then we can direct them onto some really good resources. And the last piece, Andy, is one that you are doing, aren't you?
Yep. So I'm going to do a little bit on mobile phone contracts and a new bit of legislation that's come into place and what it means for you. And actually, from the research we've done, we've found that there's a bit of a black hole where a lot of customers are dropping through at the moment. And if you're one of those people, what you can do to sort it out and make sure that you're on a better deal.
Great. So I'm going to kick straight on with the investment piece. Now, 2020 has been a very turbulent year in the investment world. So if you look at pretty much any equity market, it's been down at its low in March, about between 20 and 40%, depending on where you look, because of the coronavirus and because of the lockdowns that were implemented around the world. And so the economies around the world have slowed down, and we've entered into pretty much a depression, and then we're veering into a recessionary period. So it's been interesting because during that period, there was an article that I read in the FT some time ago, actually, that talked about Vanguard, and they have a balanced index fund. And now this is a fund that I think is owned in America, but it's still very relevant. And it's based upon the typical 60-40% equity to fixed income split. So equity to bonds, that model of 60-40. And it had its first ever 20% plus drawdown in that sell-off that happened at the end of February, at the beginning of March. And that then raised the question of whether the conventional wisdom of a 60-40 split between equities and bonds, or even a portfolio that is just purely constructed from equities and bonds, can still work in the modern environment, particularly in the post-QE era. So to explain that, after the banks and central banks around the world printed lots of money, what we've seen is that assets have become increasingly correlated. And they have periods where they become very correlated, so that means that they all move up together and down together. And we've had periods where the historic correlations have come back to their norm. So by that I mean, typically bonds and equities wouldn't move in tandem. There was a slight negative correlation, so when one goes up, the other goes in the other direction. But it has veered and changed, and it does over time. It's not consistent. But what we saw during the coronavirus sell-off in equity markets was that bond markets sold off too. So if you go back to the midweek market shows that I did, I explained it then. You could just go and look at your bond funds that you hold in your portfolio and look at their performance. I think it was between about the 6th of March and about just before the 23rd of March. You will see they completely tanked. And you would think in a period where people were looking for safety rather than risk, so they were probably selling out of equities, you think they would go into bonds. Bond markets were collapsing, and that was partly because there was a fear of the economy completely imploding. Maybe we're going to have a lot more insolvent companies, and that obviously has an impact on bond markets. So what I wanted to do as part of an 80-20 investor piece was look at portfolio construction. And I've been asked the question numerous times, where should people invest their money? What asset mix should they have in their portfolio? So how much should they have in UK equities? How much should they have in gilts? How much should they maybe have in property shares? And I can't give them the advice of what to do. So what I will do in my portfolio on 80-20 investor, on my own personal 50k one, is vary it over time. But there are a number of famous portfolios out there that have been made that are static asset allocation. So they keep the amount they've got allocated to particular assets fixed. So what I did is I looked at 4 well-known ones, and they are the Harry Brown Permanent Portfolio, the Ivy League Portfolio, the Gone Fishing Portfolio, and as I mentioned, Ray Dalio's All-Weather Portfolio. Now I'll run through each one in turn. Now the Harry Brown portfolio, that is a portfolio that was built by a chap called Harry Brown, and he was an investment analyst in the 1980s. Now his portfolio that he came up with that could make money in all conditions is based around holding 25% in gold, 25% in cash, 25% in domestic equity shares, and 25% in something like gilts. So we're talking about government bonds. Now, when I went through each of these portfolios, which I'll explain them in a second, I had to anglicize them because most of these things were built for people in America. So they use assets in America that we won't necessarily have the access to in the UK. So in order to test them, I had to make UK equivalent. So often that meant I had to use UK equities, maybe instead of some of the niche US equities. And that's so I could back test them and see how they performed during these periods and see if they did actually live up to the hype that they are supposed to have done. Now, the Ivy League portfolio, that is actually a result of endowment funds that Harvard and Yale University run. So they have billions of pounds which they run based on academic research. So you can't invest in them. It's not a fund you can buy, but you can see the mix that they use. Now, they are slightly different. So let's say I've anglicized their portfolio, then they would be in 30% in UK all companies, so UK equities, 15% in global equities, 5% in emerging markets, 20% in property shares, 15% in gilts, and 15% in index-linked gilts. Now, the Gone Fishing portfolio is from a famous book now by a guy called Alexander Green, and his portfolio is much more punchy. He puts 5% in gold, principally gold mining shares, 10% in Asian equities, 10% in European equities, 10% in global bonds, 10% in global emerging markets, 15% in North American equities, 15% in North American smaller companies, 5% in property shares, 10% in sterling high yield bonds, and 10% in UK gilts. Now that brings me to Ray Dalio's all-weather portfolio, which you've mentioned on the podcast previously. That's 7.5% in gold, 7.5% in commodities, 15% in sterling corporate bonds, 30% in UK all companies, and 40% in UK gilts. Now, that's, like I say, anglicised versions of them. So already in this portfolio, I know I read through those fairly quickly, but if you slowed it down, you've just got so much value out of that because I've just told you how to do those portfolios if you wanted to yourself based on assets you can invest in the UK. Now, I ran the numbers on these portfolios to see how they had performed. And there was another portfolio that I've mentioned previously on the podcast was the 80-20 perfect portfolio. So I did a piece of research a while ago that I sat down, it was 5 years ago, and wanted to work out, is there a portfolio you could create that had made money every tax year since the year 2000, which is the year when ISAs were invented, that had outpaced the FTSE 100 over that entire period, but as I say, hadn't lost money in a given tax year, but also had a static asset mix. And I worked out what that portfolio is. I looked at all the different types of assets out there. And I'm not going to tell you what that is. That's obviously for 80-20 investor members. So I tested that portfolio with these portfolios. Now, if you look at the sell-off between February and March and have a look at how each of these portfolios did, to give you an idea, the UK gone fishing portfolio was down between 23 and 25%. Now, the reason I say between 23 and 25, because I actually made a UK version of theirs where I didn't have North American equities in it. All the others are based on UK equities. So you can see that's very high risk. It's very punchy. It's got about 70% equities. The Ivy League was down about 21. Ray Dalio was down about 15%. Harry Brown was down about 8%. And the two portfolios that I made, which one is the perfect ISA portfolio, was only down 7% at the worst point. There was a version of the same portfolio that contained gold because the original portfolio didn't. And that portfolio performed the best over the period. So it was an interesting exercise to have constructed it. And the reason I did that is because as part of this exercise, what it showed is that portfolios that have gold exposure, particularly in the current environment, have outperformed because they're able to diversify. Gold has done very well if you look year to date. It's in a huge bull market that's been going for quite some time. And it's driven up the portfolios that have held it. And some of these portfolios, as you heard as I read through, held gold. So one of the learnings from the research that podcast listeners could take away is that gold right now is a pretty good diversifier, and it has been for a period of time, particularly in this post-QE era. And one of the reasons is because obviously as central banks keep printing lots and lots of money, its value diminishes, and gold is the hedge against that. So over a long time frame, that's why the gold price has been going higher. There are other factors as well. So it's interesting to see that play out. The only problem obviously with gold is that it's very volatile. It's almost got an equity-like movement to it. So even though the equity content of the portfolio might be low, when you throw in a bit of gold, it starts to push up that volatility. And I did a whole research piece previously about how much gold should you own in a portfolio and at what point does it become detrimental to the volatility of the portfolio, start to make it very erratic. And just to give you a steer, once you start going above 10%, it starts to have a detrimental impact on the volatility of the portfolio. It starts to make it much more erratic. Or if you think about it as a line, a wiggly line starts becoming even more wiggly. So the other thing I did was I looked at over the longer term how these portfolios did, and over the 5-year and 10-year. And I'm not going to go through all of it on the podcast. If you want to see the whole research piece, then go and sign up to 80/20 Investor. You can have a free trial and you can read it. And the portfolios that start to do better over time obviously have more equity content in them. Like I said, the Gone Fishing portfolio is about 70% equity exposure, as does the Ivy League portfolio. But when you looked at some of the other portfolios over 5 years, if you looked at the 5-year period into that low, that March low, so we had the market rally over 5 years and then dip. If you look at that period, then those portfolios were caught by the ones that protected more of the downside, so like the perfect ISA portfolio from 80/20 Investor. Now these portfolios, a bit like Harry Brown's, only have around about 20 to 25% equity exposure, and they have a very simple structure too. So they don't have, as the Gone Fishing portfolio does, about 10 different asset classes. They have only very few, and Harry only has 4. And actually, to give you a hint, the perfect ISA portfolio for 80/20 actually only has 3. And so sometimes the other message is by keeping it simple, you can actually still capture quite a bit of the upside, but you can protect a lot of the downside. But over the 10-year period, as things went on, then obviously those portfolios that had a larger equity exposures start to outperform. So the Ivy League portfolio made 88%, which is a lot over 10 years, versus 67% for the perfect ISA portfolio from 80/20 that had a gold element to it. And they have very different equity contents. In fact, the Ivy League one is taking probably about 3 times the risk. So what the message is from this is obviously each of those portfolios over the long term, the more equity content they have, the better they do, but they're much more volatile. So as somebody, if you're trying to build a portfolio that's going to conserve to the downside, then you want to try and diversify. And gold is one of those assets that has in recent history certainly helped to boost the upside, but also provide some diversification elements. And the other thing I just want to sort of throw out there, if people listening, I talked about that Gone Fishing portfolio, the original one, and it has a US equity exposure. Now, when you chart that over the longer term, it starts to smash a lot of the others. But when you boil it down, the reason it does is because in the post-QE era, US equities have been by far the best performing equity market in the developed world. So to give you some context, the FTSE 100 is up 86% in the last 10 years. but the S&P 500 is up 325%. So by just replacing your UK equity content in a portfolio with your US equity counterparts, you would make a hell of a lot more money because A, the market's outperformed, but also because of the currency kicker you would have got, especially after the Brexit vote. So there we have it. If you are looking for an off-the-shelf portfolio to use as a basis of a portfolio, if you're looking on the defensive side of things, have a look at something like the Harry Brown's permanent portfolio if you're not going to look at the 80-20 version of the perfect portfolio. If you're looking at something you want to blow the lights out a bit more over the long term and you're happy with that ups and down in volatility, then perhaps have a look at something like the Gone Fishing portfolio, which you can buy the book on Amazon that talks all about it. But one of the things I would stress about those portfolios is that people are very much, I want the one that's going to make the most money. But the reality is that the one that made the most money over the long term obviously lost a lot of money during the sell-off this year, like I said, down about 25%. Now, if you imagine if a portfolio, you had 10 grand maybe, and you lost 25% of that in the space of 2 weeks, how would you have behaved? Would you have really said, I'm more than happy with sticking with this portfolio, or would you have bailed out? Now, I think a lot of people, as much as they say they're quite passive investors and they want to stick and hold for the long term, when it comes to the big drawdowns, because don't forget the March low, nobody knew whether the market would continue to fall lower. And we obviously, theoretically, still could revisit that level now and head even lower than that. But people's behaviour, they might set out on this, I'm happy to take the risk and I'm going to go for the portfolio that's got the biggest equity exposure because I've looked back at 10 years and it's given me the most return. But if we have a market collapse, you're going to have the biggest drawdown. And that is the thing they've got to be comfortable with. Do they want to shoot the lights out, or do they actually want to get something that's going to provide a steady return over time? And I'm going to pick those two portfolios again because people can go and read about them if they want to. If you did the Gone Fishing portfolio and did the UK version of it if you wanted to, so that was using UK equities, then the annual return over 10 years, the annualized return is about 6.7% versus Harry Brown's portfolio, which is about 5.2% a year. Very different. That's why compounding over time, you can get the Gone Fishing portfolio pull away. But if you look at that, about a 1% difference year on year, the difference in volatility is huge between the two portfolios. So there you go, Andy. Hopefully it will get people to explore a little bit more and consider the assets that they hold within their portfolio.
Great stuff. So moving on to redundancy next, which is a sad state of affairs. Obviously, lots of things are happening with the furlough schemes and people are starting to return to work. But there are some people out there who aren't going to have the opportunity to return to work and are going to be having to deal with things like redundancy. And Damon, you've got a piece that covers this.
Yeah, so to give you some context, 600,000 workers in the UK have lost their jobs between March and May 2020 alone. So that's a huge number, and there are currently more than 9 million people on the government's job retention scheme. So the number of people being made redundant is only likely to go up. That is the harsh reality of the situation we are in. But what I want to do is I wanted to run through some information on redundancy and the procedures to inform people. But what I want to also say is if you listen to this piece and it is relevant to you, do go and look at the article on the Money to the Masses website, so the podcast article for this show. And we will link through to a couple of pieces that are very good. One of them was done by Which, one is the official .gov.uk website that has a lot of information on the rules and regulations around redundancy. And we've pulled together some of that for this piece. So I'm going to start just to crack through this. So employers have to follow procedures by employment law when they make people redundant. The first thing they should do is they should notify you that you're at risk of redundancy. Now, if they're reducing the numbers of staff in a particular role, then they have to identify a suitable pool of people to choose from who they will make redundant. And they have to use fair criteria in which to do that. And then they have to consult with each employee and consult with trade union and staff representatives if there's more than 20 people being made redundant. So if you haven't heard anything and you are suddenly made redundant, then it's likely that your employer has breached employment rules. The other thing is that your employer has to give you a full explanation as why you've been selected for redundancy. So they can use a number of methods. Things like last in, first out can be one method, but it can't be discriminatory. So if you take a scenario where maybe the last people in all belong to a particular demographic, let's say they happen to be all the young people within a firm, then you could argue it's starting to discriminate against a certain subset of the company, and they could open themselves up for being challenged on that. They can take methods such as volunteers. They could ask people who want to be made redundant, which they call self-selection. It could be based on disciplinary records or appraisals, skills, qualifications, and experience. Now, your employer can, in fact, make you redundant without following a selection process if your job no longer exists. For example, you might be the only employee in a certain part of the organisation where you work. The thing to remember, you can appeal if you feel you've been unfairly selected for whatever reason, and you have to write to your employer explaining the reasons why you think it's unfair. You might be asked to reapply for your own job, which is very common. I know people who are having to do that, unfortunately. But one thing people must bear in mind, if you do not apply for a job or you're unsuccessful in your application, you still technically have a job until your employer makes you redundant. So you're not redundant at the point that you don't get the job or you don't apply. They have to actually make you redundant. Now, there are a number of reasons that would automatically be deemed unfair if they were used as a reason for selection for redundancy. So if you were pregnant or you being on maternity or paternity leave was used as a selection process on the grounds of sex, race, sexual orientation, disability, or whistleblowing. So there's a whole list of these that if they were used as a selection criteria, they would automatically be deemed unfair. Now, you can apply to a court for compensation if you think you were dismissed unfairly or not consulted properly as part of your redundancy. So you can see there's a recurring theme here. There are rights, if you're going to be made redundant, that employers have to respect and procedures which they have to follow. And so you need to make yourself fully aware of them. Like I said, we're going to link through to the article so you can read them in detail. Now, you can make a claim to the employment tribunal if you were unfairly dismissed, and you can get a basic reward for that. Or if there was no consultation about your redundancy, there's something called a protective award, which is slightly different. So one of the things people automatically want to know next is the notice period. Now, the notice period can vary depending on your own contract, but there are statutory minimum notice periods in England, Wales and Scotland, and it's 1 week if you've been with the company for between 1 month and 2 years. For those employed for between 2 and 12 years, it's a week for each year of employment, and if you've been employed for 12 years or over, it's 12 weeks. Of course, your employer could offer suitable alternative employment. Now, you do have the right to refuse an offer of alternative employment. So that might be within your organisation. They say there's another job over here which they believe that you could do and would offer you that. However, if you unreasonably refuse an offer of a suitable employment, it could mean that you miss out on statutory redundancy pay. So you have to bear that in mind. So as much as the employer has to keep up their side of the bargain, there are certain rules and procedures you have to be aware of, and you have to be aware of how your actions could have implications for you when it comes to your statutory redundancy pay. Of course, if your employer has suitable alternative employment and they don't offer it to you, then your redundancy could be deemed unfair. Now, when it comes to redundancy packages, that again can depend on lots of things, including your contract. But everybody who's been within the business for 2 years or more is usually entitled to statutory redundancy, which is worked out on how long you've worked at the organisation up to a maximum of 20 years and your age. So there's a banding that goes on. If you're aged between 18 and 22, your redundancy pay per 4 years' work is half a week's pay. If you're between 22 and 40, it's 1 week's pay. If you're 41 and older, it's 1.5 weeks' pay. Now, there is a weekly pay cap at £538, with the maximum amount of statutory redundancy pay capped at £16,140. Now, these things can change if you're listening to this in the future, so do go and look at those links and you can find out more. Now, you are still entitled to any holiday pay, commission and bonuses you are owed, and these payments will be subject to tax. The rest of your redundancy package, whether it's statutory or extra, will not be taxed up to £30,000. Now, in terms of payment, your redundancy should be paid on the date that you leave the company or your next normal pay date. So you need to find out what they are. Now, there are rules, which I'm not going to go into on the podcast, about what you should do if there's something goes wrong with your payments. But as I say, you can find all the information on the article via the links. But one thing I want to quickly point out before we move on to the last piece in the podcast is if your employer is made insolvent, then you have different rights depending on whether your employer makes you redundant, asks you to keep working, or transfers your work to a new employer. But one thing that's worth pointing out, that if your company is made insolvent, then all's not lost, because it can be possible to claim redundancy payment from the government. So a slightly depressing piece to put on the podcast, but hopefully it's an FYI to people out there to understand the basics, but also to know where to look for more information.
Excellent stuff. So yeah, that moves us on to the last piece, and it is really just a short FYI piece, really. And the reason we're highlighting it is because someone in the Money to the Masses team actually found this out the hard way, and it's to do with mobile phone contracts and how the networks contact you at the end of your contract. So just to rewind a little bit and fill people in on what happened, back in June 2019, Ofcom announced some new rules which became enforceable from February the 15th, 2020, in an effort to ensure fairness for customers. And what they did is they forced telecommunications companies, so network providers like EE, Vodafone, and also pay TV companies. And Ofcom has made sure that those companies now have to warn customers when they are reaching the end of their contract to let them know that there may well be better deals out there, and really just to give them a heads up. So what used to happen is people just used to carry on paying their monthly amounts, unaware that there were better offers out there. And Ofcom doesn't like this. They like to make it fair for everyone. So now these network providers have to, by law, contact their customers between 10 and 40 days before the end of the contract to let them know. And what they need to let them know is 5 key criteria. They need to let the customer know the actual contract end date. They need to let them know the price that they've paid before the contract end date. They need to let them know any changes to the service and the price paid at the end of the period, any information about any notice period that is required in order to terminate the contract. And they also, and this is the key bit, they also need to let the customer know any best deals that are being offered by the provider, including telling their loyal customers what prices are available to new customers. So Ofcom have made it very, very clear that network providers now have to contact their customers to let them know when they're coming to the end of a deal that is, let's be honest, likely to be more expensive than the new deals that are available for new customers, which is great news. The problem is that this has only come into force from February the 15th, 2020. So there is a huge amount of people. And from what we've researched, there's as many as 20 million customers that are currently out of contract who could have benefited from these new rules. And they're sitting unaware because obviously they were out of contract before the new legislation came in on February the 15th.
And so to pull that together, what the problem was for the Money to the Masses team member is they were effectively on a contract where they've been paying for a phone over years, as everybody did, where they get a phone and want the latest iPhone, they get that. They get a more expensive contract as a result, so they don't have to pay for the phone up front. They've effectively paid the phone off, but the contract price doesn't, or the monthly amount doesn't drop. And now going forward, mobile phone companies have got to be contacting people about this. Well, what's happened is there are providers who are just leaving people on those old contracts because it was done before the date that Andy mentioned earlier this year. So it's kind of a case of letting sleeping dogs lie. And to highlight this, the team member, when they were looking at their contract, decided to do something about it and change it, not because they were notified. And they basically halved their mobile phone contract because they went to a SIM-only deal because they no longer needed to pay for a phone. They'd already paid for it. They owned it outright. The contract had come to an end, as Andy said. As soon as they triggered that and wanted their pack code so they could move elsewhere, they were getting inundated with messages from their current provider saying they could have a new iPhone for half the price of their current monthly bill, which I think is disgraceful, which is why it became a piece on the podcast, because so many of us who are listening to this podcast right now will be probably paying for a phone, already have paid for a phone on their contract, and now just still on a price plan that is effectively just profit for the provider. So go and check when your contract ends or when it ended, as it probably did previously. Note when that date was or is, and make sure you then move provider or get a cheaper SIM-only deal or contact your provider. because in the long run, it is still cheaper to buy a phone outright. I know they're expensive. It's cheaper to buy a phone outright than have it on contract through a mobile phone provider. So there are lots of people, hopefully we can save people a small fortune.
And just to follow up on that, Damien, there's a couple of quick ways that you can do this. If you're not quite sure whether you're at the end of your contract yet and you can't be bothered to speak to someone at your network provider, there is a really easy way to find out how long is left on your contract. If you text the word info, that's INFO, to 85075, and that works for all mobile phones, by the way, you should get a text back within 1 minute telling you what contract you're on, what you're paying, and when your contract ends. It's really, really simple. And even better than that, if you are out of contract and you want to change, firstly, go and find a better deal elsewhere. Make sure that you've got that information to hand. You can text your current provider for a pack code. All you need to do is text the word PAC, pack, to 65075, and within, again, 1 minute, they'll send you all the details that you need to provide your new network provider, and they'll make the switch within 1 working day. And crucially, you won't have to pay any notice period fees due to this new legislation by Ofcom. There is more information about how you can do it on our website, and we'll put that to the show notes as we mentioned before.
Yeah, I love that because that's actionable. You've given people the numbers. You said they're the last number you can text. That works for any provider. And you just wait when you text and ask for your pack code when you want to move. You'll just start being inundated with marketing messages because they've realised that the sleeping dog has woken up and they're going to try and keep you in your existing provider. But don't let them. They've been profiteering. Anyway, Andy, that is it for this week.
It is. So if you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with a number 2. Don't forget to head over to Instagram. There's lots of stuff over there. YouTube as well. And of course, you've got our Money to the Masses community group over on Facebook. Now, we're so close to 2,000 members. So if you haven't already done so, make sure you join our group and become a part of the conversation. And it was really refreshing to see that after last week's podcast, Damien mentioned the key lessons in life that he would pass on to his children, and Faye posted in the group there saying that she loved it and really asked the community what their advice would be, what would they pass on to their children, and it created and sparked a really good conversation. So it was really great to see Faye doing that. If you've got any questions from this week's podcast and you want to create more conversation around it, post in the group. So that's it, we're done. Until next time.